All right, class. So welcome to Wednesday, April 20th. This lecture will be going over chapter 15, which is the respiratory system. And today in lab for section 2 lab, you have your lab 3 exam. So later when you come to lab at 9 a.m., please turn on your video and I'll get that lab link for you right away. And that's what we'll be doing in lab today. So your respiratory system, we're working our way through the body's systems now, and we're in our respiratory system. And respiration, which is the respiratory system, involves the following processes, which is ventilation or breathing, which is moving air into and out of the lungs, the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the air in the lungs and the blood, the transport of carbon dioxide and oxygen in the blood, and then the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the blood and all of your body's tissues that need it. So all of your body cells need oxygen to create energy, and carbon dioxide is always a waste product of that cellular respiration process. So carbon dioxide needs to be continually taken out of the body to get rid of it as waste. So your functions of your respiratory system are respiration, the actual mechanical breathing in and out, regulation of blood pH, that happens by regulating the levels of carbon dioxide in your blood, voice production, your vocal cords, your larynx, that's part of your respiratory system function as air travels through them. Olfaction is included in this, which is the sense of smell. And then innate immunity has to do with respiratory system functions. So let's go a little bit through the anatomy of what we call the upper respiratory tract, first of all. Made up of your external nose, the nasal cavity, and the pharynx. So your upper respiratory tract is where air will be taken in and out through the external nose, the nasal cavity, and then down the pharynx or the throat, and then into the larynx, which is your voice box. And then we'll get into lower respiratory tract structures, which include the trachea. And you can see how the trachea has these little blue rings around it made of cartilage to keep it open at all times. And you can feel those rings if you feel your throat going down your neck. You can feel those rings keeping your trachea open at all times. So air is constantly flowing through the trachea into the bronchi and then into your lungs. The nose itself is made up mostly of hyaline cartilage, and then the nasal cavity extends from your nostrils, the nares, to the choanae in the back. The choanae or choana are the openings to the pharynx or the throat, and the hard palate will be the roof of the nose. You have paranasal sinuses, which are spaces surrounding the nose. They're filled with air within the bone, and they open into the nasal cavity. They're filled with mucus. The concha then are on lateral sides of each nose. They increase the surface area of the nasal cavity, and they're also covered in mucus to help kind of clean the air, humidify the air, and warm the air as it goes into the trachea and down into your lungs. You have nasolacrimal ducts that are carrying the tears from your eyes that have cleaned your eyes and then have opened into the nasal cavity. And this is a constant process because tears are constantly cleaning your eyes and then being drained into the nose. But when you cry a little bit more, this is why you need a Kleenex, because you have excess tears entering the nasal cavity that you need to get rid of. The nose itself helps to filter air, provides airway for respiration. It's involved in speech, so that if you're sick and your nose is really kind of congested, that'll affect how your speech sounds. There are olfactory receptors in the nose for smelling. It helps to warm the air, and then sneezing will dislodge material from the nose if your body's trying to get rid of something. The pharynx then is the common passageway for both respiratory and digestive systems. So parts of your pharynx will take in air and food. It's another word for your throat, and we divide the pharynx into 3 key parts. Your nasopharynx takes in air behind the nasal cavity. The oropharynx extends from the uvula to the epiglottis, so the little boxing kind of ball you see in the back of your throat, that's your uvula. And then the epiglottis is the bottom half of that border. Your oropharynx will take in food, drink, and air. And then the laryngopharynx extends from your epiglottis to the esophagus. And I'll show you a picture of those parts of the pharynx. The uvula is a little grape, or I call it the boxing ball. It's an extension of your soft palate. And within your pharynx, you also have the pharyngeal tonsils, which are a part of your kind of immune system that we talked about on Monday that aids in defending against infections. So here we have parts of your pharynx. You can see the nasopharynx is behind the nasal cavity. The oropharynx is behind the oral cavity, and then the laryngopharynx is right behind the larynx. Here we have the epiglottis, which is made up of cartilage, and the epiglottis acts as a little door that will shut or cover over the opening to your larynx when you swallow food. So that when you swallow food and drink will go down the posterior esophagus, which you see here. But when the epiglottis is open, air will go down the trachea itself. So that is a look at the nasal cavity, the pharynx. You can see other parts labeled here. Paranasal sinuses are air-filled spaces in the bones surrounding the nasal cavity. You can see the concha of the nasal cavity shown here, the superior, middle, and inferior concha. So that is just a look at the nasal cavity and the pharynx. Then the lower respiratory tract is made up of the lower portions of your larynx, the trachea itself, and then how the trachea splits into bronchi, which bring the air to the parts of the lungs. So here's just another look at the lower respiratory tract. You can see kind of the bottom half of the larynx, the trachea splitting into bronchi, which then take the air into both sides of the lungs. So the larynx is also known as your voice box. It's located in the anterior throat, and it extends from the base of your tongue to the trachea, and it consists of different cartilage that helps give it support to keep it open and to connect to various ligaments and muscles that surround it. The thyroid cartilage is the largest piece of the cartilage, and this is what we sometimes call your Adam's apple. It's that little pointed kind of portion of the cartilage that you can sometimes see in people's necks. You can especially see this Adam's apple in males, and that's due to testosterone that goes to the larynx to make the larynx larger in males. And that's partially due because the testosterone is lengthening the vocal cords of males, especially during puberty when a male's voice drops. That's the lengthening of the vocal cords due to testosterone. And that same testosterone makes the Adam's apple in males just appear larger in their neck region. The epiglottis is also a piece of cartilage. This is the flap or the door, I like to call it, that prevents swallowed materials from entering the larynx. So when you swallow food and drink, it will go down the posterior esophagus instead of getting into the larynx. If food or drink gets into the larynx, that's known as something getting down the wrong pipe, and usually you'll start to cough it out and hopefully not choke. The vocal folds and cords are the source of voice production in the larynx. Air will move past them and it will cause them to vibrate, which produces the sound. The force of air that goes through your vocal folds determines the loudness. And you know that if you talk really loudly, you're forcing a lot of air out of your mouth. And then the tension of the vocal folds will determine the pitch. Laryngitis, again, whenever we have a word that ends in itis, that always means inflammation. So laryngitis is inflammation of the vocal folds. And that can be caused by overuse. You might lose your voice, dry air. Sometimes you lose your voice when it's really cold and dry out, or some sort of infection. So here's the anatomy of the larynx. You see the thyroid cartilage shown here. It's this large cartilage in the front. You see the hyoid bone kind of makes up the top part. And then you see your epiglottis, which again is this little flap or door that will close the larynx off when you swallow food. You see other cartilages listed as well that I think we go through in lab, and you might go through in lab in your other anatomy classes. And those cartilages keep your larynx open at all times. So there are the parts of the larynx, and again, it will eventually lead into the trachea. Here are vocal folds, the vestibular and vocal. So you see the vestibular folds are known as false vocal cords. They're kind of on the exterior surfaces. And then what you see in white are the vocal folds, the true vocal cords. So, and this is actually a laryngoscope. You can put a little camera down someone's larynx and actually see their vocal folds opening and closing, which is, I think, really interesting to see. So you see kind of the space leading into the trachea there, and then the vocal folds will open and close as sound passes through them to cause speech. So laryngoscopes are often used if there is some sort of infection or laryngitis that the medical doctor needs to see or look into. Again, if any food or drink gets lodged in the larynx or further down in the trachea, you'll cough to try to get it out. But again, this is why you don't want to give little kids, grapes that aren't cut up, hot dogs, popcorn, because things that get lodged within this larynx can block off air going into your lungs, and that can be just deadly, very scary. Okay, so then here is the trachea, also known as the windpipe. It consists of these C-shaped pieces of cartilage that are lining it to keep the trachea open at all times. It contains cilia pseudostratified columnar epithelium. And what that type of epithelium does is the cilia moves mucus through it. The mucus traps anything harmful that you might breathe in. So it's a very good epithelium that lines your trachea to try to keep your trachea clean. What smoking does is it kills off the cilia and even kind of really damages the entire epithelium. So smokers, again, they have to kind of create their own cough to get rid of harmful substances they breathe in, because they don't have that natural cilia that moves those harmful substances out for them. Coughing dislodges materials from the trachea, and the trachea eventually divides into what we call right and left primary bronchi, which take air into the lungs. So the bronchi is the first division off of the trachea. It connects the trachea to your lungs. It'll still be lined with cilia, and it will still contain those pieces of cartilage that are C-shaped that keep them open at all times. And again, that's just really important because you want this airway open at all times so that air can constantly get into and out of your lungs very easily. Then the lungs themselves are the primary organ of respiration. They're cone-shaped. The base rests on the diaphragm, and the apex actually extends above your clavicle. So you can feel your clavicle, your collarbone, and then just know that kind of the apex of the lungs kind of goes right above the clavicle. The right lung has 3 lobes to it, so it's a little bit larger than the left lung that only has 2 lobes. That's because your heart sits a little off center to the left. So your left lung leaves a little space for your heart to sit in. Your lungs contain many air passageways and divisions for air to go to every segment and part of your lungs, so that gas exchange can occur. And we'll go through some of those divisions that are shown here. So I'll show you a picture of how the trachea divides into bronchi and then lobar and segmental bronchi in a little bit, but this is just kind of a list of how the air travels through those lung passageways. The trachea splits into what we call primary bronchi, and that takes air to each lung, either the right and left. Primary bronchi split into secondary bronchi, which brings the air to the different lobes of the lung. 3 lobes on the right side, 2 lobes on the left side. The lobar bronchi split into segmental bronchi, which take the air to different segments of each lobe. And then eventually segmental bronchi split into bronchioles, which are very much smaller in diameter. Bronchioles terminate in terminal bronchioles, which will kind of end in respiratory bronchioles. And eventually we get down to what we call alveoli, which are the structures where actually gas exchange occurs. So the alveoli look like kind of clusters of grapes. They're very numerous, and the alveoli are specifically where gas exchange will occur. So here we kind of have the anatomy more of the trachea and the lungs, showing how the trachea splits at an area called the carina into primary bronchi. The primary bronchi split into secondary bronchi, going to all the different lobes. Secondary bronchi split into tertiary or segmental bronchi, splitting into bronchioles to terminal bronchioles, and we'll look at a different picture. So you can start to see how it kind of looks like tree branches, how your trachea splits into all of these branches to again get air to all of the parts of the lungs. The visceral pleura describes the covering of the lungs themselves. The parietal pleura describes kind of the membrane that the lungs sit in as it kind of lines the inner thoracic cavity. And then the pleural cavity is the space between those two pleura. Here's a look at the right lung and the left lung. You can see on the right and left lung, we both have this area called the high lung, which is the area where all of our blood vessels enter and exit the lungs, because our blood vessels are taking air and blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen. You'll also see the primary bronchi entering and exiting there, as well as your pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins. In the right lung, you can see the superior lobe, the middle lobe, and then the inferior lobe. Whereas in the left lung, you just see the superior and inferior lobe, because you'll see kind of these depressions or indentations called the cardiac impression, cardiac notch, and that's where the heart will sit. Because remember, the heart sits a little bit left of center in your sternum, so the left lung needs to give a little bit extra space for your heart to sit in. So then we get down to the alveoli, which are the small air sacs, and this is where gas exchange occurs, and you should know that. They're all surrounded by capillaries, because the capillaries will have blood in them that will pick up oxygen that moves from your alveoli into your capillaries. You have about 300 million alveoli in your lungs, and an asthma attack is contraction of the terminal bronchioles, leading to reduced airflow to the alveoli. So asthma attacks are scary because it's constricting the terminal bronchioles, meaning that there will be less air getting into the alveoli, and the alveoli are where your capillaries are picking up oxygen that your body needs. So here's just a look at how we see these bronchioles ending in these alveolar sacs. So these alveoli and alveolar sacs, they're kind of these clusters of grapes, I like to call them, and they're covered with capillaries, and you can see those capillaries shown here. One end will be the pulmonary vein that's bringing deoxygenated blood to the capillaries, and the other end will be the pulmonary artery, which is bringing deoxygenated blood to the alveoli, and then the pulmonary vein will leave with red oxygenated blood. And in this area of the pulmonary capillaries, you see the capillaries kind of surrounding these alveolar lung sacs as air is moving from within the alveoli into the pulmonary capillaries. The respiratory membrane describes in lungs where gas exchange occurs between air and blood, and it's formed by the walls of alveoli and the capillaries. And we'll talk specifically how air gets from the inside of your alveoli into your capillaries. You have alveolar ducts and respiratory bronchioles that also contribute, and your respiratory membrane will just be incredibly thin for the diffusion of gases to occur. That means for oxygen to go from your air into your blood, and for carbon dioxide to go from the blood into the air to be breathed out. And I'll show you a picture in the next slide, but we'll just describe the layers of this membrane. There's a thin layer of fluid from the alveolus. There's simple squamous alveolar epithelium. There's a basement membrane of alveolar epithelium. There's a thin interstitial space, a basement membrane of the capillary endothelium, and then the capillary endothelium itself. So what do I mean by all that? So real quick, what we're looking at here, and we'll take a step back so we can all remember this. So we are looking at an air-filled space of an alveoli. It's kind of a single air sac. And this is, remember, kind of the final branching point of your trachea. So your trachea comes into your lungs, branches to many different branches. Eventually it ends in these alveoli, which are air-filled sacs. And this is where we have a lot of oxygen because it's what we've been breathing in. Oxygen, if we look at this picture at the bottom, we're describing the membrane, which is the kind of wall between the alveolus in blue and the capillary in red. So we see here a red blood cell, and we show how oxygen travels from the alveolus, the air, into your red blood cells, and how carbon dioxide, which is a waste product that your cells need to get rid of, travels from your red blood cells out into the alveolus. So that carbon dioxide can eventually be exhaled as waste. So this respiratory membrane shows the different layers between the alveoli and between the red blood cells and the capillaries. So these are all the different things that make up the respiratory membrane. But again, it's incredibly thin so that the diffusion or movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide can happen automatically. There will always be more oxygen in your alveoli. So oxygen will always diffuse naturally into your red blood cells, and carbon dioxide will always diffuse naturally out of the red blood cells into your alveoli where there's less of it. The pleural membranes and cavities describe the coverings around the lungs themselves and how they sit within the thoracic cavity. The pleura is a double-layered membrane around your lungs. The parietal pleura is the membrane that lines the thoracic cavity, which is right underneath your ribs, and the visceral pleura covers the lung surfaces themselves. Visceral and viscera always refer to organs. So when you see the word viscera or visceral, that always will cover the organ itself. And then the pleural cavity is the space around each lung. So here we have kind of a cross section showing where we've cut across these lungs in the person. Looking at it from the top down, we see these layers. So here's the parietal pleura lining the thoracic cavity right inside the rib cage. The visceral pleura is the membrane lining your lungs themselves. And then the pleural cavity is the space between the two. And that's kind of what we just described there. Ventilation then, this is the process of breathing, which is moving air into and out of the lungs. It uses your diaphragm, which is a skeletal muscle that separates your thoracic cavity above from the abdominal cavity below. And the diaphragm is pretty much known as the most important breathing muscle. And what polio did in the 30s and 40s, polio paralyzed your diaphragm. So these kids with polio could not breathe on their own. So they had to be put in these iron lung machines to help change the air pressure of the lungs to help them breathe. So diaphragm is very important. The phrenic nerve innervates the diaphragm. So some sorts of toxins and poisons will paralyze the phrenic nerve, and that will mess up the diaphragm, which will most likely cause someone to suffocate. So diaphragm, very important for ventilation. Inspiration is breathing in. It uses your diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles, which are muscles between ribs. And expiration is breathing out, which just uses the diaphragm. But if you do a forceful expiration, kind of like breathing out as much as you can, that will also use internal intercostal muscles, which is another layer of muscles between your ribs. So here we have the effect of the muscles of respiration on thoracic volume. So normally When your diaphragm is relaxed, it takes on this cone-like shape appearance. So at the end of expiration, after you're exhaling all the air, your thoracic cavity and thoracic volume gets smaller because you don't have air in your lungs. So the diaphragm assumes this cone-shaped relaxed position. And then at the end of inspiration, so as you're breathing in, the diaphragm becomes flatter. And that's why we show this down arrow. What the diaphragm does is it kind of pulls your thoracic cavity down to increase capacity of your thoracic cavity as you're breathing in and air is expanding in your lungs. Extra muscles you can see here that are attached to the external surfaces of the ribs will help with respiration. Specifically, external intercostals help, internal intercostals help as well. These are all kind of the muscles of expiration, breathing out are shown there, and the muscles of inspiration are shown on the left side. So muscles of inspiration, breathing in, are shown on the left side of the screen, and muscles of expiration are listed here, showing on the right side of the screen. Pressure changes and airflow. So changes in the pressure of air within the lungs helps to encourage airflow either in or out of the lungs. So for example, when your thoracic cavity volume increases, when your lungs get larger as you're breathing in, pressure will decrease. And when your thoracic volume decreases, pressure increases. This is a physics inversion law of pressure. And air will always flow from an area of high to low pressure. So what this means is that when you inhale, your diaphragm descends so that your rib cage expands, the thoracic cavity volume increases and pressure decreases. Your atmospheric pressure, which is always the air outside your lungs, will then be greater than what is the pressure inside your alveoli. So air will naturally move into your alveoli or into your lungs as you inspire. So it's kind of this like sucking mechanism. As you breathe in and your thoracic cavity increases in size, air will naturally be kind of sucked into your lungs. And then as you exhale or expire, your diaphragm relaxes, your rib cage recoils and gets smaller again. The thoracic cavity decreases so that now the pressure inside the lungs is greater than the pressure in the exterior atmospheric outside air. So air will naturally move out of your lungs when you exhale due to these pressure and volume changes that are created by making your rib cage larger or smaller. So these pressure changes help airflow either kind of get sucked into your lungs when you breathe in or get sucked and pushed out of your lungs when you breathe out. So it's a really efficient process and one that you don't want to ever block or constrict in terms of disease or some sort of mechanical blockage. Because again, the idea of breathing in and out and respiration is your body's way of getting oxygen that it needs to create energy and getting rid of the carbon dioxide that it has formed as a waste product. So this just describes these pressure changes through inhaling and exhaling, showing how the alveolar pressure equals atmospheric pressure. So there's no air movement. When alveolar pressure is less than atmospheric pressure during inhalation, air will move into the lungs. Air pressure equals atmospheric pressure at the end of inspiration. And then as the diaphragm relaxes, as you exhale, alveolar pressure will be greater, so air will naturally want to flow out of the lungs again. Lung recoil is the idea that our expanded lungs can decrease in size and kind of go back to their initial size, and this occurs during quiet expiration, and this is due to elastic fibers and thin film of fluid lining your alveoli. Surfactant is very important. It's a mixture of lipoproteins, which are made up of it's like a fatty protein. It's produced by secretory cells of your alveoli, and it's a single fluid layer on the surface of the thin fluid lining alveoli. And what surfactant does is it reduces the surface tension of your alveoli, so it keeps your lungs from collapsing on themselves. In other words, it keeps the alveoli always inflated. You always want your alveoli to look like an inflated balloon so that airflow is constant through them. Without surfactant, your alveoli would kind of collapse like a deflated balloon, and that's what would cause your lungs to collapse. So surfactant is very important for keeping your lungs kind of open and your alveoli open at all times. Pleural pressure is the pressure in the pleural cavity. It's always less than alveolar pressure. And this is what keeps your alveoli from collapsing on themselves as well. So like I said before, you always want your alveoli, those little air sacs, to constantly be opened. And there's always a certain amount of pleural pressure from the pleural cavity that keeps your alveoli open at all times as well. Other factors that influence the rate of pulmonary ventilation. So the rate at which you breathe, for example, a lung elasticity is that describing how your lungs need to recoil or relax between ventilations, and this is actually decreased by emphysema. Lung compliance is the expansion of the thoracic cavity, and this will be affected if your rib cage is damaged, if you've broken some ribs. So these are all factors that can influence your breathing rate and how much air your lungs can take in. And then respiratory passageway resistance. This is, self-explanatory. Anytime you get some sort of resistance or blockage in the respiratory pathway or constriction of your bronchioles, this can occur during an asthma attack, an infection, or even a tumor that's blocking a part of your lungs. This will also influence ventilation rates. Pulmonary volumes. So we have a way to measure how much air we breathe in and how much air we breathe out. And we use a device called a spirometer, which measures these different pulmonary volumes of breathing in and breathing out. This part of the lecture is important because anyone with, a tumor, lung cancer, emphysema, other disease or disorder within the lungs, their doctors are going to be very interested in how much air their lungs are taking in and taking out. And we describe different volumes of your lungs with a couple of different definitions. The tidal volume is the volume of air inspired or expired during quiet breathing. So tidal volume is just normal, probably what you guys are doing right now, unless you're like working out and running, while you're listening to me right now. You guys are probably all just quietly breathing right now. This is always about 500 milliliters. Inspiratory reserve volume is the volume of air that can be inspired forcefully after a normal inspiration. So go back to your childhood days and who could hold their breath under the water the longest. You take in a really deep breath. That's your inspiratory reserve volume that you can inhale forcefully. Expiratory reserve volume is the volume of air that can be expired forcefully after a normal expiration. So kind of pushing all the air out of your lungs. And then residual volume, this is always the volume of air remaining in your lungs after a maximal expiration. There will always be a little bit of air in your lungs at all times that we cannot measure with a spirometer, but we have a general idea of how much that volume might be that you'll never be able to get out. And that's a good thing. You always want a little bit of air in your lungs at all times. Then we can measure someone's vital capacity, which is the maximum amount of air a person can expire or exhale after a maximum inspiration. So it's taking your tidal volume, which is quiet breathing, plus extra volume you can exhale, expiratory reserve volume, plus anything extra you can inhale, the inspiratory reserve volume. And that gets us your vital capacity. The total lung capacity is simple then. It just takes the vital capacity plus anything residual left in your lungs to get our total lung capacity. And we can measure this using a device that is hooked up to the mouth. It's basically just a tube that measures how much air goes into and out of your lungs. And And we get a graph that looks like this. Here's our normal tidal volume kind of shown right in the middle. That's always about 500 milliliters. The inspiratory reserve volume gives us our maximum inspiration value. The maximum expiration will give us our expiratory reserve volume, but you'll notice here in blue is always our residual volume, which will always be about 1200 milliliters, which remains in the lungs. And then you can see on the right our capacities. We can get an inspiratory capacity, a vital capacity, and then a total lung capacity with how we add up those volumes, which again, we can find out from this spirometer, this gadget that your doctor might have you breathe in and out of, especially if you have a lung disorder, emphysema, pneumonia, because your doctor is going to want to know if you're getting the correct and adequate amount of air into and out of your lungs. Different factors can influence pulmonary volumes, your gender, age, height, and weight. And most of these just have to do with the fact that gender, for example, males often have, larger lung capacities because they're just taller. So, but not always. Your height and your weight can often also have a significant of this. So a really, a smaller person with a smaller thoracic cavity won't be able to take in as much air. Your age, naturally, thoracic or pulmonary capacities can decrease with age, just as your lungs and muscles lose the ability to kind of stretch out and recoil as much as they want to. Okay, so then we talked about respiratory exchange, and now we're going to talk more about gas exchange, respiration being inhaling and exhaling of air. Gas exchange, we're going to look at the respiratory membrane. So we'll look at where gas exchange occurs between the blood and the air, primarily occurring in those alveolar air sacs, but some will occur in the respiratory bronchioles and alveolar ducts. That respiratory membrane that I briefly described to you as kind of the boundary between alveoli and those capillaries that take in the oxygen from the air, we do not find this in your bronchioles, bronchi, and trachea, and it's influenced by the thickness of the membrane, the total area of the membrane surrounding those alveolar sacs, and the partial pressure of the gases, which is what we'll talk about now a little bit. So the respiratory membrane thickness, if it's thicker, that means that diffusion, or the passageway of carbon dioxide and oxygen, won't pass through as easily. Pulmonary edema or swelling can decrease diffusion, so the rate of gas exchange could be decreased. Oxygen exchange is always affected more before carbon dioxide because, as always, carbon dioxide can always just diffuse more easily than oxygen in general. The total surface area of all the alveoli, so this entire respiratory membrane, is about 70 square meters, which is about the size of your basketball, of a basketball court, which is huge. And again, it can be decreased if you ever need lung tissue removed, if anything is destroyed from lung cancer or emphysema. Partial pressure describes the pressure exerted by a specific gas in a mixture of gases. So for example, at sea level, the total atmospheric pressure of all gases is about 760 millimeters of mercury. The atmosphere contains about 21% oxygen, and the partial pressure for oxygen is about 160 millimeters of mercury. The upper letter P always describes partial pressure of a certain gas. So you'll often see in your textbook, and as you go into more anatomy and physiology, PO2 just means the partial pressure of oxygen in a mixture, for example. Diffusion of gases in the lungs. The cells in your body use oxygen to create energy, and they produce carbon dioxide as a waste product. And blood that comes back from tissues and enters your lungs will have decreased oxygen partial pressure and increased carbon dioxide partial pressure because it's coming from your tissues to your lungs to get rid of that carbon dioxide as a waste. Oxygen will always diffuse from the air in the alveoli into your capillaries, into your blood, and carbon dioxide always diffuses out of the blood into the alveoli so you can exhale that carbon dioxide as a waste product. So this just shows you how gas exchange occurs, and you don't need to know or remember specific numbers of partial pressure, but what it's showing you is that partial pressures of these gases always mean that if it's greater, it'll always move from an area of greater pressure to an area of lower pressure. So here is venous blood coming from the heart, and it's traveling to the lungs to pick up oxygen. In the alveoli, there's always more oxygen present. So oxygen will always enter into the bloodstream because it's flowing down its partial pressure concentration gradient. And carbon dioxide is always flowing out back into the alveoli, into the lungs, where your lungs will exhale that carbon dioxide. So this kind of circulation of blood will then go to your heart, because then your heart pumps oxygenated blood to all of your body's tissues. And here at the cellular or tissue level, you see how oxygen gets offloaded into your body's cells, because your cells will have a partial pressure of oxygen that's left than what's being carried in the oxygenated blood. And at this level, your tissue cells will unload or kind of push carbon dioxide back in to this blood to be taken back to the lungs to be exhaled. So this is what gas exchange describes, where in the body carbon dioxide gets put into the blood at your tissue level, and then it'll get offloaded in your air sacs. Oxygen gets loaded onto in your lungs and then offloaded at your tissue level so that your tissues and cells can use that oxygen. Diffusion of gases in tissues, this just describes the flow of oxygen and carbon dioxide throughout the body, going from lungs to tissue. Blood flow will always go from the lungs through the left side of the heart to tissue capillaries, carrying oxygen. Oxygen will diffuse from the capillaries into interstitial fluid because the pressure of oxygen is always lower, so that oxygen will always diffuse into your tissues. Oxygen diffusion from interstitial fluid into the cells then is less as well, because the pressure of oxygen will be less in those cells. So again, this is just showing how a red blood cell carries oxygen and carbon dioxide in its cells, and how oxygen will always be offloaded into tissue cells that need it, and carbon dioxide will always be picked up into red blood cells as a way of taking that carbon dioxide eventually out of the body as a waste product. What this molecule is, this is called bicarbonate ion, and we'll talk about this very briefly. But bicarbonate ion is what carbon dioxide gets changed into as it gets carried in your red blood cells. And this bicarbonate ion helps to control pH levels of the blood. And we'll briefly talk about that. Gas exchange in the lungs, it shows how the bicarbonate ion gets turned back into carbon dioxide, which gets exhaled into your lungs, diffused into your lungs so that you can exhale the carbon dioxide as waste, and showing how oxygen gets picked up by your red blood cells in your lungs, and it's carried in your red blood cells in hemoglobin. So carbon dioxide and blood pH, and we'll talk just very briefly about this. So carbon dioxide always goes from your cells to your capillaries, and carbon dioxide enters your blood and is transported in your plasma with blood proteins and as a bicarbonate ion. And carbon dioxide reacts with water to form carbonic acid, and bicarbonate ions will dissociate into a hydrogen ion and a bicarbonate ion. So what you see here, what I've circled, these hydrogen ions and the bicarbonate ion, that is normally what carbon dioxide is transported as throughout the blood. And all you need to know is that the levels of this bicarbonate ion, the levels of that will determine blood pH. Carbonic anhydrase from red blood cells, it's an enzyme. It increases the rate of carbon dioxide reacting with water. And really simply, as your carbon dioxide levels increase in your blood, the pH levels of your blood decreases. So that just means that, remember, a low pH means your blood is very acidic. So if you have lots of carbon dioxide in your blood will be very acidic, and that can lead to problems. And that's why you need to be exhaling and getting rid of carbon dioxide, because if you keep too much carbon dioxide in your blood, it will make your blood very acidic, decreasing blood pH and leading to problems. Rhythmic ventilation, normal respiratory rate is about 12 to 20 breaths or respirations per minute. In children, it can be a little bit higher, and the rhythm is controlled by your brain, the medulla oblongata, and the rate is determined by the number of times your respiratory muscles get stimulated. So this just shows the respiratory structures in the brain, showing in your medulla oblongata, you have a respiratory center that innervates the muscles that control breathing, and that will control your respiratory rate. So how many breaths you take in and out in 1 minute. More nervous control of breathing, that you have a higher brain center that allows for voluntary breathing so that you can control and think about on your own. So when you want to hold your breath underwater, you can take that voluntary deep breath in. Emotions and speech can affect breathing. And we have what we call a Herring-Brewer reflex, where it inhibits the respiratory center when the lungs are stretched during inspiration. So this just goes on to show nervous and chemical mechanisms of breathing, how nervous control can affect your breathing rate, chemical control can affect your breathing rate. So that means that if you have a really low pH level in your blood, that means you have lots of carbon dioxide building up in your blood. Your breathing will automatically, you'll start to hyperventilate to try to get out that excess carbon dioxide as much as possible. And this is what the chemical control of breathing kind of describes. So we have chemoreceptors that are monitoring blood pH levels. And again, your blood pH levels are always affected by carbon dioxide levels in the blood. So again, if you have a lot of carbon dioxide in your blood, it will make your pH of your blood very acidic. And this will automatically kick into gear kind of an increasing breathing or hyperventilating, so that your body is kind of controlling or trying to get rid of excess carbon dioxide because the blood pH levels are so acidic. Low blood levels of oxygen will also stimulate chemoreceptors to try to increase breathing. So if your blood picks up that there's not enough oxygen present, you have chemoreceptors that will try to increase breathing as well. So lots of regulations of blood pH and blood breathing. This shows you the regulation. If blood pH increases, for example, it'll try to decrease breathing to increase your carbon dioxide levels. And if your blood pH decreases, if your blood pH gets very acidic, your effectors in your muscles will try to increase breathing to get rid of excess carbon dioxide levels. So lots of regulation of breathing because it directly relates to blood pH and the chemical composition of your blood as well. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording there.